Avner is in the philosophy department at Tufts University. He published 2 books that focus on the question of philosophical method in contemporary analytic philosophy, making the case for the continued relevance of Wittgenstein and ordinary language philosophy. Wonderful books. He's also written extensively about aspect perception in Wittgenstein as it relates to Kant's work and to work in the phenomenological tradition. And he's got 2 forthcoming books on the subject.
So the passage I chose to talk about today is taken from the third part of the Claim of Reason, the part about morality. And what I'm going to say about it is largely taken from a recently published paper which I wrote after and in response to Stanley's death. From now on, I'll call him Cavell. The paper mostly focuses on Cavell's masterful response in the argument of the ordinary to Kripke's book on Wittgenstein on rule following and private language. But it begins with a passage from the Claim of Reason that encapsulates for me much of what I have learned from Cavell. In the passage, Cavell responds to Charles Stevenson, giving what is supposed to be an example of an exchange in which one person A is expressing a judgment whose purpose is to persuade another person B to do something A wants B to do, in this case, to give a certain speech. What most troubles Cavell is that on Stevenson's account, the nature of the relationship between A and B is not relevant for an understanding of the exchange. In particular, what A says B ought to do is simply what A wants B to do, not what A believes it would benefit B to do, morally or in some other respect. In other words, A's care for B and respect for B's position are taken by Stevenson to be irrelevant to an understanding and assessment of A's ought and the utterance in which it features, nor are the history of A and B's relationship and the particular circumstances of the exchange taken to be relevant for an understanding and assessment of A's "you promised" and of B's response. In another paper that I wrote this past summer, I argue that much of that is also true of recent work on what is called moral testimony, and that the morality reflected in that work is therefore, in effect, the morality of the moralizer. Here is Stevenson's example. A says, "You ought to give the speech as you promised." B responds, "That is unfortunately beyond my power. My health will not permit it." And here is Stevenson's gloss on that example. This example deals with the consequences of a judgment's influence. A is endeavoring to influence B to give the speech. If B's reply is true, then whatever influence A's judgment may have on attitudes, it will not have the further consequence of making B speak. Realizing this, A will be likely to withdraw his judgment. He sees that it cannot have its intended effect. A may withdraw his judgment not merely because it will fail to serve its original purpose, but because it may have effects which he, in kindness, does not desire. It may lead B to be perturbed about his disability. To this, Cavell responds with a list of questions, and one can feel his exasperation, but also his sense of urgency, the sense that such moments represent philosophy literally losing its mind. Cavell says, "Does A assume that B has forgotten the promise? Doesn't take it seriously enough? Doesn't realize that what he said was legitimately taken as a promise? If so, why not tell him? If not, then why remind him of the fact? Does A not know that B is disabled? Then, when he finds out, does he withdraw his judgment because he sees it cannot have its intended effect, or because he sees it would be incompetent or incoherent not to? And how does he see that it cannot have its intended effect? Because he sees that B is disabled? Then are we to imagine that A goes to the hospital to visit B, and after seeing both of B's legs in traction, says, 'You ought to give the speech'? Or is the disability less obvious, so that A is in some doubt as to whether B's condition is as serious as he says? Then how does he see or realize that his judgment will not have its intended effect? Perhaps he sees that B is adamant. That might be a clear case of realizing, finally, no matter how hard you try, that your judgment cannot have its intended effect. But we've forgotten that speech in our bewilderment. Was it important? Important enough that you, and I'm noting the shift from third to second person here, which I find significant. You are willing to urge B to risk his health to give it, or go there in a wheelchair if necessary? Then B's reply, my health will not permit it, is not enough to make you realize that your judgment will not have its intended effect. And if the speech is that important, then does B not know this? And if he does, then has he done nothing about it, having become ill? Has he, for example, not tried to find or suggest a replacement, or have the meeting rescheduled, or dictated a speech which could be read? If that would be uncalled for, then why is it so important that he give the speech? Why ought he to? But enough. The speech is not important. It doesn't exist. And neither does a moral relationship exist between these people. I can think of any number of similar moments in Cavell's earlier, more youthfully combative work. And it was through such moments in Cavell that I began to see the ethical existentialist dimension of ordinary language philosophy, and thereby came to believe that I could express myself philosophically, by which I here mean as a professional philosopher and teacher of philosophy, and mean what I say. In my own work, I have sometimes responded in similar ways and with something like the above tone to what are supposed to be examples of human conversation that have been used in the works of contemporary analytic philosophers. For example, in theorizing about knowledge. What's happening in philosophical examples such as Stevenson's? Driven by certain theoretical ambitions and guided by certain theoretical commitments, however vaguely or partially articulated, the philosopher produces an example of a piece of human conversation in which the protagonists utter words that it is very hard to imagine any real competent speaker uttering. And hard, not primarily because people as a matter of empirical fact don't talk that way, but because if anyone did utter those words under the circumstances the philosopher invites us to imagine, it would be very hard to understand them, to see what they mean, how their words are to be taken. As Cavell puts it right before presenting Stevenson's example, it baffles imagination altogether when we try to conceive of persons saying what Stevenson gives them to say. In other cases, we could imagine a context in which the words uttered by the protagonist of the philosophical example would make sense. But in my experience, it then invariably turns out that the words thus understood do not actually support the philosopher's professed theoretical ambitions. For example, in response to John Hawthorne's presentation of what he calls the lottery puzzle, which centrally concerns our knowledge of future contingencies, I have argued in The Crisis of Method in Contemporary Analytic Philosophy that no natural, genuine use of the word no in conversations about the future is puzzling, standing in apparent tension with what you might call our metaphysical finitude and epistemic fallibility, and calling for a sophisticated theoretical treatment in the way Hawthorne would have us believe. The real puzzle is what leads philosophers to give such false accounts of themselves. For as competent employers of words such as ought, promise, and know, they surely must know, even if mostly non-cognitively, the conditions for putting those words to some intelligible use or another, for meaning them in some intelligible way or another, and the sorts of commitments and liabilities one would normally incur in putting those words to this or that use. Surely, Stevenson knows the relevance of the sorts of questions Cavell asks to the competent employment of promise or ought, and to its competent assessment. And surely Hawthorne knows that the transcendence of the future, as we might call it, the familiar and inescapable fact that it always could, and occasionally does, frustrate or outstrip even some of our most reasonable expectations, stands in no real tension with our ordinary and normal use of no in conversations about the future, but rather is part of the shared background against which such conversations have the sense they have for us. What makes them forget or ignore all of that when they philosophize? There is an ambivalence, I have found, in Western philosophy in general and in analytic philosophy in particular, toward everyday human discourse and toward the world of experience of which speech is an inseparable part, and apart from which it would not have whatever sense it has for us. On the one hand, it seems that philosophers often find it hard to go very far without using supposed examples of everyday speech and everyday situations, perhaps as a way of reassuring themselves and others that they are theorizing about something real and pertinent. But on the other hand, they tend to think of themselves as in the business of uncovering a metaphysical reality, or else a system of semantic rules, that underlies everyday speech and experience and is theoretically separable from them. They cannot believe, it seems, that anything truly important or enlightening could be found in what Wittgenstein metaphorically refers to as the gray rags and dust of everyday situations and everyday experience, and therefore forego altogether the work of examining them. They wish, as Wittgenstein puts it, to penetrate or see through phenomena such as knowledge, understanding, intention, commitment, promises, and so on, as those phenomena come into view in the sorts of things we normally and ordinarily say in humanly significant situations. Because they take our ordinary and normal use of words to be no more than an effect, an indication of something else that they imagine as lying behind it. And it is that something else that their theories are supposed to capture. What the philosopher wishes to penetrate or see through is not this or that particular phenomenon, but all phenomena, the phenomenal world altogether, if you will. He is ready to trade, in effect, the world he converses with, as Emerson puts it, or lives through, as Merleau-Ponty puts it. That is, the world he experiences and responds to in words or otherwise prior to any theoretical reflection, for the world he thinks. And this, by the way, connects with Aspen, your passage, and with something that I think Barry Stroud absolutely fails to get about the real ordinary language Wittgensteinian response to skepticism about the external world. In attempting to separate a world we may think or speak of from the world we speak and think in, and to theorize about the former while disregarding the latter, the philosopher exhibits what Cavell came to call skepticism, which may roughly be characterized as the refusal to accept or to acknowledge our responsibility for the meaning or meaningfulness of our words, and hence for the intelligibility of our world. The age-old philosophical wish to speak or to be able to speak about what Kant calls the world as it is in itself, that is, about the world as it is apart from our ways of making sense of it, and hence apart from the worldly historical conditions of our sense-making practices, thus comes to be seen in Cavell's Wittgenstein as the flip side of the wish not to be implicated by those ways and conditions and partly responsible for their maintenance. The philosopher to whom Cavell's Wittgenstein is responding wishes to be able to leave behind altogether the worldly conditions of making this or that sense with one's words, to transcend at once the situatedness of speech and the countlessly many ways in which it situates us. He feels, as Cavell memorably puts it, that, quote, he must say and think beyond these worldly conditions of sense. He wants to speak without the commitments speech exacts. That's Cavell. But he, the philosopher, still wants to be able to talk about, understand, and explain promises, knowledge, justification, meaning, understanding, truth, and so forth. And then he, the philosopher, finds himself entangled in difficulties that are rooted precisely in the expectation or fantasy that should be possible. Cavell's storm of questions invites us to project ourselves imaginatively into the sorts of situations that Stevenson's example purports to exemplify, and that his theory, Stevenson's, purports to illuminate, and thereby to remind ourselves of what such intersubjectively significant moments are like for those who inhabit them, and of the worldly background against which such moments and the words employed in them mean what they mean for us. Cavell's implied claim is that if you don't know that and how, the sorts of questions he's raising may be pertinent to the understanding and moral assessment of the exchange Stevenson invites us to imagine, then you do not know what promise or making a promise or ought or any other morally significant term means, and therefore cannot reasonably hope to make contact in your theorizing with the intended objects of your theory. And the broader lesson, as I understand it, is that if you attempt to theorize from a perspective that is imagined to be altogether outside our shared world of background, as Cavell calls it, and blocks it from coming into view, then you should not be surprised to find with Stevenson that human discourse is nothing but an endless series of attempts to exert literally senseless influence on one another, or, as Kripke in effect proposes, to reach and secure agreement on nothing we can make sense of.